Let me go ahead and, of course, go into and discuss the, of course, different review topics that we've got. Of course, first talk about the rise of. I think we're going to talk about the rise of really the Byzantine Empire is really the first topic I'll kind of go into first and talk about that, and then we'll get into like also the Middle Ages and also the main historical events that happened, of course, in the Middle Ages. So it says, what was the Byzantine Empire? The Byzantine Empire was like this Eastern Roman Empire, the version of the former Roman Empire, but it was more of a Hellenized Christian empire that was more based in the East, like especially around like Greece and Turkey. But it was at one point controlled by Greece, Turkey, Syria, Israel, going down like into Egypt at one point. And it was different than the Western Roman Empire in that, like, it was more of a continuous, Christian type empire where heavily influenced by Greek. Like, basically, Greek was their main language that they wrote everything and spoke in, pretty much. The main religion, of course, they had was Greek Orthodox Christianity. Sometimes called Orthodox Christianity as well. That became the chief church, that they had in the East and where the Orthodox Church kind of originated from. And of course, the Western Roman Empire had the Catholic Church, which of course developed in medieval times in Europe. They did have a main religious leader, of course, which was the Patriarch of Constantinople. How long did the Byzantine Empire last? Well, I guess if you start from 330 AD or CE, where Constantine founded Constantinople, and of course, up to 1453 when Constantinople fell. I think it's like 1,123 years. So it lasted over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire. The empire that conquered it eventually was the Ottoman Empire in 1453. They conquered Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. But that particular empire really by that time was like really small. It was based around like Turkey and what is also part of Greece. The official date of when the Byzantine Empire ended is usually 1453, AD or CE, either one. Where was the location of the Constantinople and its peninsula? Well, it's kind of now located in the western part of the Republic of Turkey, but it's actually on the European side, across from where the Dardanelles Strait is. It's kind of like right below the Black Sea region. And it was, of course, built on a peninsula that was heavily fortified, especially on its western approaches. So, yeah, it's now part of Western Turkey today. It's like a major city, now, but it's not its capital. Ankara is. Who founded Constantinople? I think we already know that, but it was Constantine the Great. He was, of course, the founder of it, close to about 330. And, of course, it got named after him. What was the Theodosian Wall? The Theodosian Wall was the main fortification of Constantinople that was built on the western side of it. It was built in the it's built around the 400s, early 400s, by Theodosius II, who I believe was a grandson of Theodosius the Great. And they mostly built the Theodosian Wall to keep out like the Huns and other groups, Visigoths and others that were trying to attack the empire. The Byzantines had this thing called Greek fire. I think I mentioned a little bit about it, but it's like this. It was a type of secret weapon they had that was kind of like similar to napalm, and they would like shoot it at like ships and men, and basically they would burst into flames and just incinerate them. So it's kind of a secret weapon that they were kind of known for. I think it was developed by some Syrian guy or something like that, but it was very secretive. I didn't really talk about the next two, though, but I'll kind of mention them anyway. The Golden Horn was just a nickname they called the harbor of Constantinople, I guess because of all the wealth that went into it. And of course, it was shaped like a horn. Mizu, M-E-S-E, is just what they called the main road of Constantinople that ran from the Theodosian Wall to where the Hagia Sophia is and all that. And it means middle way. So it's like their main street they had. Great Palace, I talked about that. That was the central palace of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. I think it was first built by Constantine, expanded by other emperors like Justinian. Hippodrome was the famous Byzantine racetrack that was built in Constantinople. It's built next to the Great Palace, and it was used for predominantly chariot racing, which it's not there anymore. It's pretty much gone. The Hagia Sophia, which is still there, of course, is a famous Orthodox cathedral that was built in the 6th century. It was constructed, of course, by Emperor Justinian the Great, and it's considered one of the first great, Christian churches that was built in the world, especially in the East. Who was Emperor Justinian I the Great? He, of course, was considered the greatest emperor of the Byzantine Empire. He reigned about mid to late 6th century. And he's famous for several things. He's famous for being the one that reconquered the West. If you know about this, really the only emperor to really try this, where he reconquered the West from like the Visigoths and other groups like the Visigoths and I think the Vandals and so on, and Ostrogoths as well. So he would actually take back part of the West. He also was famous for the Justinian Code and its building projects, such as the Hagia Sophia. Procopius was a famous Byzantine historian that lived around when Justinian was around. And he wrote several works, like The Secret History of Justinian, The Wars of Justinian, I think were the famous ones that he wrote. And Justinian also had a famous wife who was like his consort or empress consort, which was Theodora, who was real powerful behind the throne and all that. Let's see. Well, yeah, of course, we talked about that one right there. Yeah, what was Justinian famous for in his expansion of the Byzantine Empire? He reconquered like North Africa, where it had been controlled by the Vandals, and then he took over part of also southern Spain from the Visigoths. And he also re-seized Italy, and I think part of the area where the Yugoslavia used to be from most of the Ostrogoths. He was able to retake those areas, and it was mostly done by Belisarius, who was a famous Byzantine general. In fact, one of the last major Roman generals you really hear about. And so it was only briefly, though. Like the Byzantine Empire, that was the biggest expansion of it, and then after that, it started shrinking, pretty much in the Middle Ages. What was the Justinian Code? The Justinian Code was a famous law code system that was developed by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. It was later called the Corpus Juris Civilis, which means body of civil law. It was composed of almost 5,000 laws in it, and it was considered to be a very famous law code system that codified Roman law back to like something like the 2nd century. And of course, it influenced other codes later, like the Napoleonic Code, and a lot of modern codes or law codes are heavily influenced by the Justinian Code and all that. What was the plague of Justinian? It was this massive outbreak of, they think, bubonic plague that hit the Byzantine Empire when Justinian was emperor. I think it made him ill, but it didn't kill him. But the plague evidently killed thousands of people within the Byzantine Empire, and I think areas throughout the Mediterranean region. They think it kind of played a major role in why the Byzantine Empire declined. The Nika riot, I guess I'll just mention about that issue. The Nika riot was a famous incident that happened in 532, where there was a massive riot that broke out in the Hippodrome, because I think I told you the chariot racing teams were kind of like almost like gangs or whatever. And anyway, they was like open revolt, and so it actually ended up burning down, I think, a lot of the city with this riot or revolt, as they call it sometimes. And so Justinian went in and basically sacked it, put it down. And I think they say he killed like close to 30,000 people, crushing the revolt, which they say his wife was the one that was really behind him getting to do it, to stay in power. I think this was early in his reign, I believe. That shows how ruthless Justinian was. A lot of people think he was a really bad emperor. sometimes, but he's really one of their best ones, I guess, overall. All right, let me move on and talk about next. Of course, had the rise of Islam that also happened too, as well. Where geographically did the religion of Islam develop in the Middle East? It started in the Arabian Peninsula, like basically where Saudi Arabia is today, the western part of it, where Mecca is and all those other cities that are in that area. And who was Muhammad? Muhammad was the founder of Islam. He, of course, was a famous Arab prophet who came from the Arabian Peninsula, born in Mecca, like a merchant. And eventually he started his religion, if you know about this, in the early 600s. But at first he wasn't, it was kind of met with hostility, about this Muhammad. So he fled, or the flight of Muhammad, called the Hijra, where he went from Mecca to Medina. And it's at Medina that he eventually developed basically Islam as a religion overall. And the two cities, of course, where Islam started, by the way, is Mecca and Medina, which is in western Saudi Arabia today. It says, what do the terms Islam and Muslim mean in Arabic? Islam usually means surrender to God or submission to God. And then Muslim means either surrendering ones or submissive ones, like to Allah or God, basically. What is the Quran? The Quran, of course, is later, seen as the, holy book of Islam, which was eventually written down over time. It actually means reciting. I don't think I told you that, but it's supposedly because Muhammad heard all this information from, I think, the angel Gabriel, I think it was, and eventually wrote all this. They started writing it down later, and over time, Islam was based off of the teachings of Muhammad and all that. And over time, it was compiled within, I think, a few decades after Muhammad died. It takes a while for that to happen, but over time it does. And of course, it's originally written in Arabic and then, of course, translated to other languages, of course, now today, like English or whatever. What are the 5 pillars of Islam? These are just like these various teachings of Muhammad, I guess, or things that he wanted Muslims to do to live a good life as a Muslim. And of course, I'll kind of go through them. I didn't really give you the Arabic names. So those are the Arabic names. They often call it Shahada, which means faith, like faith in Allah and Muhammad. Salat is like prayer. I guess traditional Muslims would pray 5 times a day, facing Mecca. Zakat is like almsgiving, where you gave to like the poor and all that. Zam is like the idea of like fasting, especially during Ramadan. And then the Hajj is the pilgrimage, where some Muslims will make a pilgrimage to, Mecca and all that, Medina. What are the most famous mosques that they have in Islam overall? They got the Prophet's Mosque, of course, which is in Medina, where Muhammad's buried. The Mecca, they've got the Grand Mosque, or it's called different names, Great Mosque, of course, where the Kaaba is. Jerusalem's got the Al-Aqsa Mosque, of course, as well. Those are like the 3 holiest mosques really in Islam. Mosque is like a church for Muslims. And then Jerusalem, of course, they also got the Dome of the Rock, which is like a shrine, of course, that they have from Muhammad that's there also as well. That's what that is, the Dome of the Rock, which was built a little later after Muhammad died. They had these successors to Muhammad that later they were called caliphs, which I didn't really talk much about them. But these were successors to Muhammad that kind of followed him. They were the leaders in Islam after Muhammad died, and most of them were not related to Muhammad. Like Abu Bakr was like a father-in-law. Umar or Omar, either one, was another one that came next. He was the one that conquered the most territory. Uthman was another one. Also, he's a son-in-law of Muhammad. And Ali was a cousin of Muhammad. Those are all the different ones that they had. It's really the caliphs are the ones that start spreading Islam into the Middle East. From Saudi Arabia, it went into North Africa, later into Spain, and then it pushed also into like the kind of like southwestern Asia is where it also ends up also as well, like pretty much Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and even getting into Pakistan and around India as well. Two main religious sects of Islam today, of course, are Sunni, which is the majority, and of course Shiites, of course, or Shia, of course, which is the other one, of course, which is more of a minority. All right, and I think that's the bulk of the stuff. I don't know if you have to know about all they had the Caliphate dynasties they had too as well, which I think they had the Umayyads and the Abbasids had them, which the Umayyads ruled like around Syria, where Damascus is, and the Abbasids ruled from Baghdad and Iraq that they had. And you had all those other empires, like they got the Seljuk Turk and Ottoman empires as well. They have later, which the Turks were Caucasian peoples from Central Asia that also became Sunni Muslim later as well, which we'll talk a lot about the Turks later, of course, and all that. All right, then getting into the Middle Ages, why is the period after the ancient times called the Middle Ages? It's called that because the fact that there's this kind of middle period, dark age, that comes in between the fall of the Roman Empire and, of course, the modern times that come in later, like the Renaissance that we have later that we have. And the Middle Ages is separated, usually medieval times, into three sub-periods. We've got the early Middle Ages, you got the high Middle Ages, and then you got the late Middle Ages. It varies on all the dates on them, but usually the Middle Ages starts around 500 or so, or before that, and goes up close to about 1,000. And then from about 1,000 to about usually close to 1,300 is usually considered the high Middle Ages. And then from the around 1300s up to the 1500s, you've got the late Middle Ages that you've got. But a lot of times it was called the Medieval Dark Ages, of course, was the other name that they called it, which they started calling it later, more or less, by the end of the Middle Ages. What were some influences that made up the mix of culture that became the Middle Ages and the so-called New Europe that formed later? I told you it was kind of a combination of like different cultures, like mostly Roman and German were the two main cultures that really influenced like Western Central Europe a lot, even Eastern Europe too, because you had like the Vikings going into Russia and all that from Scandinavia. And then, of course, mixed with, of course, the Catholic Church in most of Europe. There were other groups that came in, like the like the Moors in Spain and all that, and Avars, Hungarians coming in, from the east. So you had some other Asiatic influences as well, for Middle Eastern influences that you had in the Middle Ages. But most of medieval Europe is like eventually Catholic, over time. Who are the Franks? The Franks were these Germanic peoples that invaded the Roman Empire. They took over Gaul, where France is today, and they formed the Kingdom of the Franks. And they had different dynasties. Their first major dynasty was called the Merovingian dynasty, which was founded by this king named Clovis I, who was related back to this guy named Merovich, who I think was maybe some kind of early ruler of theirs. And Clovis was considered important because he was the first major Catholic medieval king that's around. And the Franks kind of start spreading, Catholicism throughout Europe, pretty much from France into Germany into Italy and all that. Over time, though, the kings of the Franks became like figureheads, and they were controlled by these political military figures, powerful nobility, that were called a major domo, or a mayor of the palace. And they have the real power on the Merovingian throne. And it's because they controlled like the king's palace originally, and so hence the name being used. But over time, they controlled like the policies of the king, the military, everything. And eventually, Charles Martel emerged to eventually seize power as major domo. Martel, if you know about it, was a great Frankish general. He was known for his military victories in the early 8th century, 732, I think it was, right? Battle of Tours, where the Moors, which were basically Spanish peoples that really were from North Africa that were Muslim, and they tried to invade France in the early 8th century. And of course, Martel stopped them cold in central France. And so later, Martel was known as the Hammer, is what they called him. And so Tours was kind of an important battle because they think it kind of, solidified, Frankish culture, throughout medieval Europe, but also the Catholic faith. It was kind of, stabilized, I guess, in Europe after that. What dynasty replaced the Merovingian dynasty? It was replaced by the Carolingian dynasty, which Pepin III, the Short, called it, I guess they started calling it after that. And he was a major domo, the son of Charles Martel, that seized the Frankish throne. And so he named the dynasty after his father, Carolus. His father was, of course, known as Carolus Martellus, of course, or Charles Martel. Let's see. Who was Charlemagne? Charlemagne was the son of Pepin III, the Short, and, of course, known as Carolus Magnus or Charles the Great. He would, of course, become the greatest king and ruler of the Franks. He would eventually form like an empire out of it. What historical work written by the historian Einhard describes his reign? Einhard was a Christian writer, like a monk, who lived under Charlemagne. He wrote a book about Charlemagne's life at the time, which was called The Life of Charlemagne. So it's where we get a lot of information about Charlemagne's empire and all that. How large was the empire of Charlemagne? Charlemagne's empire stretched from really almost part of northern Spain, most of France. He controlled Germany and also Italy. So it was a massive empire which rivaled the Byzantine Empire in the east. I think it was actually larger than theirs. What was founded in 800 when Charlemagne was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III of the Catholic Church. That was, of course, the Carolingian Empire is usually the official name they call it. This empire is kind of seen as like a Western Roman Empire. Is I think kind of what the Catholic Church kind of is trying to create out of this. But it was more of a Germanic version of the Western Roman Empire, of course, ruled by the Franks. But it's the idea to create this Christian empire in the West. It was kind of like the old Roman Empire, but it was ruled by the Franks. What later name is dubbed, which becomes most of the region of Germany ruled by the emperors? Well, what happens later, if you know about it, was that the empire broke up. Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire broke up. And the eastern part of it, of course, became known as the Holy Roman Empire, which is the name that's used later in the Middle Ages. And, of course, they say that, Charlemagne helped found it. Of course, Charlemagne had a son named Louis the Pious, who was also emperor in the West. But what happened was his sons all eventually broke it up because of a Carolingian civil war. And so in 843, the Treaty of Verdun was signed, where it broke up the Carolingian Empire into different parts. And of course, the three parts it was, as you know, they had three parts: Western, Central, and Eastern Francia. Which really, out of those parts, Western part, of course, became what they call France, and then the Eastern part became Germany, and the parts in the middle became other countries that were also, of course, in Europe as well. That's and I think I mentioned before how the Treaty of Verdun was one of those treaties that helped to kind of really break up all of Europe into different countries like it is today, especially in Western Central Europe. So that's why Belgium and all these countries, kind of Switzerland, it kind of exists, the way they do, of course, later. Then we talked about the Vikings. Who are the Vikings? Where they developed before they invaded Europe? The Vikings were Scandinavian peoples up in the north. They developed in like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and they invaded sometime, they think, in the 800s CE, like 9th century. So-called Viking Age usually peaks about 9th to 11th centuries. They're called nicknames. They called them Viking because the fact that they were kind of seen as these bandits, pirates that came in and attacked people So that's kind of what the term Viking really meant to most Christians in Europe. They often called them also Norse or Norsemen or Northmen because they came out of Northern Europe or Norway. Of course, the term used, but ones in Denmark are called Danes. I think the ones in Norway are called Normans and all that. And then, of course, the ones from, Sweden are called Swedes, whatever. What were the longships? The longships were these famous shallow drafted wooden vessels of the Vikings that, of course, used sails and oars. And they were, of course, very famous for being very fast and swift, 10 to 15 knots. And they used these longships to sail down rivers in Europe, seas, oceans. They even, like I said, crossed the Atlantic Ocean and explored North America in them. I think they were sometimes called dragon ships, I told you before. So yeah, some of the Vikings are kind of very famous for having. They also had a lot of different gods. I think I told you that were very famous, that were well known. Odin was the chief god of the Vikings, the god of thunder that ruled from Valhalla and all that. His son, of course, is Thor, the god of thunder, lightning, etc. Balder was another son, the god of bravery. They had. I think I talked about the twins Frey and Freya, right? Frey was I think Frey was like a god of like fertility predominantly. And then he had a sister named Freya. He was like kind of like this fertility goddess, kind of similar to like Aphrodite that they had. And I think I mentioned about Loki too, was another god that was famous. That was the god of mischief, luck, fortune, the trickster god. We talked about like where they settled. The Vikings went all over Europe. They settled like into Britain, like England, Scotland, Ireland, those areas. Iceland. They went into the North Atlantic, like Greenland. I think even also may have at one point they think settled, of course, North America. Also, they went into northern France, northern Germany. They went into Russia. At one point, they even settled part of southern Italy. So they're all different parts of Europe. The Vikings at one point. Eric the Red was a famous Viking who came from Iceland that eventually colonized Greenland, which he helped coin the name, as I remember. This was in the late 10th century. And he had a son named Leif Erikson, which is spelled different ways. They often call him Leif the Lucky. And he was predominantly a Viking explorer that found, they think, part of North America, eastern Canada. He discovered what they call Vinland. As they call it, because Vikings came back later and created some kind of Viking settlement in eastern Canada. They called it Vinland because of supposedly wild grapes that grew there. I think it's really meant wine land or vine land. That's what it meant. And anyway, they think on what is maybe the northern tip of Newfoundland, they may have created some kind of Viking settlement there. There may have been other Viking settlements elsewhere too. Eastern Canada as well. And if you know about it, they think that they found some archaeological sites, in Newfoundland that does prove that the Vikings may have been the first to actually explore the Americas before any other Europeans come later. Like Columbus and John Cabot, that come later, almost 500 years later. Who are the Normans? The Normans were Vikings, they think, that came out of, Norway. They settled into northern France, an area that later became known as Normandy, and they eventually became a vassal state to the Kingdom of France. It's later called the Duchy of Normandy. They still call it Normandy today. And the Normans later mixed with the French people that were there, like Catholics, and so it became this kind of Viking French culture that's there. And they are descended from, they had this guy named William the Duke of Normandy, who was descended from King Rollo, who was one of their founders. And he became famous in 1066 for crossing the English Channel and invading England, so-called Norman conquest, and defeated the last Anglo-Saxon king in the Battle of Hastings. So October 1066. And William went on to be known as they called him William the First or William the Conqueror in England. And he brought over the early stages of what would be English feudalism that'll be developed there, because feudalism kind of develops in France originally and all that. Who are the Rus? Why are they important in early Russian history? The Rus were Vikings that came out of, they think, Sweden or Finland. They explored like the Ukraine and Western Russia. And they helped found like the early Russian states, which were called the Kievan Rus. These were mostly a collection of states that were based around like where Kiev is and Moscow. And they were ruled by mostly like dukes. I think they call them grand dukes or grand princes usually. And they think they had a founder named Rurik, Prince Rurik, who was some kind of Viking that a lot of the early rulers were descended from. It's where they get the early Russian dynasty that's called Rurik. They also had Oleg. I think he was another one that came later. He was a ruler. And close to about 1000, the most famous early Russian ruler was Vladimir the First. They called him, or Vladimir the Great, or Vladimir the Great, as they call him, I think, in Russia. And anyway, Vladimir, of course, is known for being one of the Russian rulers that would convert, the Russian people to Christianity, heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire. And so they adopted Orthodox Christianity and all that. And of course, I may have mentioned before how in Russia that the Byzantine Empire influenced a lot of their language, their architecture, and so on overall. And so Russia later becomes this third Rome that they have. We then talked about the next major topic, which was the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of military attempts by the military campaigns by the Catholic Europe to reconquer basically the Holy Land and part of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea region, the Middle East. This would be areas of, like we'll get to later, which is part of Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel. What Catholic Pope started the crusade? They believe it was Pope Urban II. He was the one that started it because he had been basically asked by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus I to basically help the Christian brothers. And so the next thing you know, you got all these crusaders trying to attack the Middle East to get all this land back. Which Muslim conquerors brought on the Crusades? Mostly the Seljuk Turks, who came out of Central Asia, who became Sunni Islam. They settled like around Turkey, Syria, Egypt, and all that. And so they're kind of very warlike, and so it kind of created a lot of conflicts between, of course, both sides overall. What occurred in the First Crusade? The First Crusade was really considered one of the most successful crusades. Of course, they had. This was, of course, a crusade where eventually they would retake back part of the Middle East. They re-seized Turkey. They took over, like southern Turkey was taken back, Syria, Lebanon, and also Israel. And you had mostly these like noblemen that were kind of involved in it from different states. And I think they also have those, like, I think they have those guys like Peter the Hermit and all that earlier they had, but that didn't really succeed. But it wouldn't be until late, like second, third crusade, they start seeing kings really getting directly involved in it, more or less. They set up these kingdoms afterwards that were called the so-called Crusader states. So these are the kind of states they created afterwards in the Holy Land that were there. They're also called Outremer states, which meant overseas states. And there were like mostly 4 of them that they had originally. Overall, they had basically what is the Kingdom of Jerusalem. That was the one that was the most famous one that they had. They had also the County of Edessa was another one. Principality of Antioch, and then they had the County of what was the other one? The County of what was the other one? I can't remember the 4th one for some reason right now. It's in the back of my head. But that one, I was looking up that one. The other one I'm missing is, I forgot it for some reason. That one's called the County of Tripoli. County of Tripoli, County of Edessa, Principality of Antioch, and then the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Anyway, Kingdom of Jerusalem was the only one that really was actually the most powerful. It had a king. Anyway, it lasted the longest. And in fact, after they had the, I think, First Crusade, you had a deal where the Second Crusade happened, where I think it was the county of Edessa fell first. It fell first, and they tried to get it back, but it failed. Let's see. He says, what were examples of military knightly orders that were created by the First Crusades? Of course. Well, after the Crusades happened, they had these Catholic knightly orders that were created afterwards. The most famous was the Knights Templar, which were founded right after the First Crusade. And it was an order that was found in Jerusalem because it was named after the Temple Mount, where the old Temple of Jerusalem is. In fact, I meant the Knights of the Temple. And it was really the most powerful one, the most wealthiest overall. A lot of them were semi-monastic. The fact that they were kind of like these skilled warriors, knights. They were kind of deeply religious as well. They also had the Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John, that were like basically another order that was popular as well. And then they had also the Teutonic ones that were also like a German order. By the way, each one of these orders had like different like flags and crosses and all that. Of course, the Knights Templar had a red cross. The Hospitallers, of course, had a white cross. And then the Teutonic ones had a black cross. What caused the Third Crusade to develop? Well, Third Crusade was a crusade that was caused by Saladin. Saladin, who was a famous sultan and Muslim general who was actually of Kurdish origins. And he basically reconquered Jerusalem in 1187, part of the Holy Land. So it sparked the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade was this major crusade that involved powerful kings in Europe that actually sent forces and participated directly. And so that's why they call it the King Crusade, because all these different kings that were involved in it. Some of the famous kings that were in it, the one that was most famous was, of course, King Richard I, the Lionheart, who was from, of course, England. They also had the other king that was well known, which was Philip Augustus, the second of France. He was involved in it. Frederick Barbarossa I was also in it too, in Germany briefly, but I think he died on campaign. If you ever study about that. Really, the one that fought the best, overall, I told you, was Richard I. He fought basically Saladin to a draw, like at the Battle of Jaffa, I believe it is. He retook like northern Israel, where Jaffa and Acre is. It led to like a truce afterwards, but of course, the Third Crusade really failed to take back Jerusalem and all that. The Fourth Crusade, what happened with that one? That was a failed crusade where around 1202, 1204, Crusaders were supposed to basically attack the Middle East again, take Jerusalem. But as you know, what happened, the Crusaders turned on the Byzantine Empire, which they never really trusted because they were not the same religion. They were not Catholic, they were Orthodox. Created a lot of animosity between them. They didn't really trust them. And of course, Constantinople was also very wealthy. And so in 1204, if they sacked Constantinople, one of only two times that really anybody's ever broken into the fortified city of Constantinople, now Istanbul. And anyway, they think it caused it was partially one of the causes, I know, they say, of the Great Schism, or also called the East-West Schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. And so you get the split afterwards, where the Catholic Orthodox churches never really get back together. That's supposedly why they fought the Crusades, was to bring these two Christian brothers together and all that, but it actually did the opposite. I think I mentioned not to confuse that with the papal schism that happened later in the Middle Ages, where they had two popes, one in Italy and one in France. Then we talked about the Mongols. We had the Mongol Empire that formed right after that time period, right after that, actually, at the Fourth Crusade. You had the Mongols. The Mongols, of course, were Asiatic peoples that came out of Mongolia. They were known, of course, for fighting on horseback. They formed the Mongol Empire, which I told you was one of the largest land-based empires in the world, like 9 to 10 million square miles. It's not quite as big as, say, the British Empire, but Britain had a lot of land all over the world, islands and so on. And the Mongols were called different names. Some people call them the Horde, Mongol Horde. Russia, they call them the Golden Horde. They also call them the Devil's Horsemen. And I told you they were known for committing vast genocide where they killed millions of people, 30, 40 million or whatever it was, throughout their conquests. And their empire stretched from like Eastern China and Korea all the way to Eastern Europe at one point, getting close to like the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and I think they almost reached, I believe, the Mediterranean Sea at one point. Genghis Khan, also known as Temujin, was the founder of the Mongol Empire. He was believed to be some kind of Mongol leader that merged the Mongolian tribes together in the Mongolian steppe, and eventually invaded, like China, invaded parts of Eurasia, and formed this vast empire out of it, which he conquered a majority of it on a short, like 20 years or so. Lived in the early 1200s. Kublai Khan was later one of his grandsons who lived more into the later part of the 13th century. Kublai Khan was one of the founders of the Yuan dynasty in China, which was the imperial dynasty of the Mongols, who ruled China until 1368. And Kublai Khan was one of the men that helped to start trade with like the West. Like he met Marco Polo and all that later. And so you start seeing the Silk Road, all the trade kind of going east to west towards Europe afterwards a lot. What was the Golden Horde? The Golden Horde was a khanate of the Mongols that ruled like Russia. Anyway, it was a type of state of the Mongols that was started by Batu Khan. He was a grandson of Genghis Khan. And he created the state, but you study about later, a lot of Turkish mercenaries called Tatars, controlled a lot of the vast territory of Russia. And anyway, the Russians called it Golden Horde because of the fact that they had to pay, suppose the Tatars, I guess mostly them, like money. Tribute money, like using gold. I think there was a story about how I think they lived in these golden colored tents, hence the name being used. But they had other, they had Khanate one they had too, didn't they? And a bunch of other. Chagatai was another Khanate they had as well. So they had these other different states that they, of course, had also as well. Then I briefly talked about the Timurid Empire. The Timurid Empire was this empire. It was basically a Turkish-Mongolian empire that formed in Persia later, like I think around the 14th century. And it's up to it's around early modern times, and it's mostly it controls an area from like Iraq and Syria through Iran. And it controlled at one point part of India, like around Pakistan. It was founded by this man named Timur, who was a type of Turkish Mongolian general. They called him a beer, which is like a type of leader of theirs. It's kind of like a sultan, I guess, before the Ottomans started using that later, Ottoman Empire. And anyway, he actually developed the empire, and it was called different names. Some people called it also Tamerlane's Empire because they called him Timur the Lame. And anyway, So that's where the name came from. And later, there was a later Timurid ruler named Babur who invaded India more into it, took it all over, like the whole subcontinent, and formed the Mughal Empire out of it. So the Timurid Empire kind of became the Mughal Empire later in more of the east. They have. So I think parts of the western part of it get conquered by the Ottoman Empire over time as well. What were some major events of the late Middle Ages? Of course, I told you they had the Black Death, they had the 100 Years' War, and then, of course, they had the Renaissance. What were some major events of the late Middle Ages? Of course, we'll talk about first Black Death, of course. The Black Death, of course, was this massive pandemic of bubonic plague that broke out in Europe and Asia, and it was believed to have been caused by this bacterium, some kind of plague bacillus that they now call Yersinia pestis, that lived in rats. And it was actually in the rat flea's stomach. And so when it would bite you, it would give you the plague originally. And so they don't find this out until like the late 1800s. That guy named Alexander Yersin, I think, was the man that discovered it in the 1890s. And so that's where the actual name of the bacterium came from over time. But I told you they call it bubonic plague because of the fact that the bobos that people would get, where their lymph nodes would flame up and pus up or whatever, and it would look like a knot on you or whatever, like around your neck and chest and around also your groin area. Then your skin would turn black because if your flesh would really die off. But they also call it Black Death because of the amount of people that died from it. So Europe, they may have had like 25 million people die from it. That was the big impact of it, wiping out like a third of the population or more. They do think that the plague could have killed as many as 100 million or more, throughout Europe. And I've seen as high as like maybe 200 million that may have died worldwide. So they're not sure how many died of it, but it's a lot over time, going back to Justinian's time in the 6th century when I guess the first thing kind of happened. They think it came from Asia through the trade routes, like the Silk Road into the Black Sea region. And I told you how the Italians brought it to Europe and gave it to everybody. Also, I don't have it in there, but I told you that there were various, like the medieval people had different names for the plague. Like they call it the Great Pestilence or Great Plague or Great Mortality, Great Everything, I guess, basically. And medieval people thought it was caused by all kinds of things, like bad air, foul air they were breathing in, like miasma. Some people thought that God was punishing them because they weren't going to church, or the devil was behind it. Some people thought witches were behind it. So a lot of women got burned at the stake for being witches. People thought the Jews were behind it. They poisoned all the wells. And I think also there was another deal where some of the scholars in Europe, like universities, like University of Paris or whatever, thought it was being caused by the fact that the planets had lined up in a certain way. Like they think astrology or something like that may have affected it as well. All right, let me move on and talk about the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was considered the most famous conflict of the Middle Ages, and lasts off and on from the 14th to the 15th century. What was it? It was a conflict between mostly France and England to control that country, that region. And the English were, controlled by this dynasty called the Plantagenet dynasty, sometimes called Angevin. Plantagenet is considered one of the most famous medieval dynasties, by the way, of Europe. And then you also have the Valois dynasty, which was a cadet branch of the Capetian dynasty. Went back to early Middle Ages. So you had these two dynasties that fought it out. And what happened was the King of England, I think it was Edward III, invaded France, tried to conquer all of France because he thought that he should be the King of France too. Like England and France combined, I guess. Why is considered one of the first wars to introduce new weapons that made medieval warfare obsolete? Well, they have these new weapons like the longbow, cannon, the gun or musket. A lot of these would make like knights, knights in armor on horseback obsolete. over time. So people won't be doing that anymore later. So the last war like that probably fought mostly. And England introduced things like the cannon and the longbow, the Battle of Cressy, basically. So that kind of helped to kind of really control the war a lot for a long time, especially up to the early 1400s. The English really had an advantage up to the Battle of Agincourt. And then also they had catapults and things like that. Like the French had the trebuchet and all that. And that helped to also change the war. But cannons played kind of a major role too, on kind of also changing the outcome of the war as well. Who was Joan of Arc? Joan of Arc was this young French maiden. They call her sometimes the Maid of Orleans or Maiden of Orleans, who became one of their big leaders in the early 1400s. And she led French troops in battle, the so-called Siege of Orleans. And they believe the Siege of Orleans was considered the turning point battle of the 100 Years' War. It's a war where it was a battle where basically if England would have conquered Orleans, probably that would have been the end of the war. The English would have probably conquered the whole thing. But after that, after they took back Orleans, it basically inspired the French to keep, fighting the English. They eventually drove them out. That's what happened. What historical period was believed to be the main catalyst that started the modern times? Well, that's the Renaissance. The Renaissance was this historical period of Europe. It was more of an intellectual movement in Europe, where there was a rebirth in art, culture, history, science, math, which started in Italy, and it eventually spread to the rest of Europe. It was a rebirth. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and mostly it was a rebirth due to the rediscovery or restudy of the Greco-Roman cultures, classics of the past, which was, before considered pagan, And the Renaissance starts in the 14th century, 1300s, and it goes up to around the 1500s. It's about the time period of it. So it's really the thing that kind of leads into, the modern times where Europe's kind of starting to get out the Dark Ages. Where did the Renaissance develop? What time period? I think I already talked about that, but it started in a lot of cities like Florence is believed to be one of the main cities where the Renaissance took off at that point. But it also spread to other cities, Milan, Genoa, and so on, Venice, eventually Rome, predominantly in the north. That's where it was in northern Italy. And over time, it spread to other periods. I'll kind of mention the sub-periods of it too as well. They have sub-periods of the Renaissance too, like the really 1400s is sometimes called the early Renaissance, basically. High Renaissance, of course, comes after peak of the Renaissance, early 16th century. And you have also the so-called Northern or later Renaissance that spreads into the rest of Europe. But, who are the humanists? Who are they examples, of course, of humanists? Humanists were mostly scholars, artists. They were in the Renaissance, mostly in Italy. Some were outside of Italy. And these were people that were mostly interested in studying about human culture in general, rather than say more about maybe religion. And the Petrarch is considered to be one of the founders of humanism, the father of it. He was one of the first to actually start restudying the past, translating Greco-Roman classics and things like that. So he started the movement. Other people were I talked about Dante Alighieri. He was considered one of the first great Italian poets in the Renaissance, who wrote the Divine Comedy. You had also Picasso, all around the same time, 14th century. They all knew each other, those three. Picasso, who wrote a series of short stories called Decameron, that was very famous as well. It's written around the Black Death. Also, you had as well, I think I mentioned about Donatello was one of the first Italian sculptors that really started to copy the old Greco-Roman style of statues that were basically mostly new. And I think toward the early 1400s, he had one statue called Statue of David, which influenced a lot of other artists later, like Michelangelo, and so on. I think I mentioned also Niccolo Machiavelli, also is kind of famous in the Renaissance in the early 1500s. He was a diplomat, historian, and I think politician from Florence. He wrote a famous book called The Prince, which was considered one of the first modern political treatises. And that book really influenced like a lot of modern politics, especially with monarchs that ruled parts of Europe later. Then we talked about the High Renaissance. The High Renaissance was like the peak of artists that were big in the Renaissance. Talked about Leonardo da Vinci. These are artists who are peaked in their art early 1500s. And Da Vinci was known for a lot of different things. I think I told you about the Mona Lisa, of course, which is considered one of the greatest paintings ever done, of course. He also did, of course, the Last Supper, which was done in Milan, fresco painting, which considered those two really his masterpieces, of course. But Da Vinci was a genius. He was a polymath, I told you, that kind of had different ideas. And if you look at the so-called Da Vinci notebooks, it kind of gives you an idea that this guy kind of knew everything. Had all kinds of invention ideas in his head, He's also an architect as well. Also, then we talked about Michelangelo as well. Michelangelo was known for, painting the Sistine Chapel. Of course, was one of his greatest painting masterpieces. But he was really more known as a sculptor, like the Statue of David and all that. You may have heard of the Pietà. I think it was another famous statue he did with the Virgin Mary and Jesus and all that. So yeah, that. And then I talked about, I think Raphael Santi, I think was another one I told you about, who did a lot of artwork as well, like painting the Sistine Chapel. He was the one that was famous for like painting the Virgin Mary, like so-called, I think the Madonna Sistine and Madonna the Chair, I think were some other paintings that he did that's well known. Seems like all those guys are ninja turtles in modern times. Seems like a bunch of Donatello and all those, kind of funny. But anyway, and then of course I told you the so-called Northern Renaissance or later Renaissance, it spread outside Italy, especially about the 1500s and all that, like into France, Germany, England, etc. So you get Erasmus in Germany, Geoffrey Chaucer, Shakespeare, those kind of people in England writing different things. I think Chaucer had the Canterbury Tales and all that. And of course, as you know, Shakespeare was known for his great plays and, of course, sonnets and all that. So anyway, that, of course, is the bulk, of the topics, of course, that will be on, of course, the final exam. Like I said, if you have any, comments, questions, of course, about this review over the study guide topics, let me know more or less. But yeah, the semester's over. Can't believe it, I guess. Anyway, just make sure, you wrap up on those assignments. Some of you are going to be exempt, you don't have to take the final exam and all that. But I'm going to kind of work on that probably starting on Saturday. I think April the 1st, May the 1st, I'll kind of work on trying to figure out who's exempt. Because I know right now we do have one Canvas quiz that's still open, number 7, which is on the, I think on that later Roman Empire. I got to see who finishes that, and then I'll figure out, of course, who's exempt, of course, for the final exam. So that's it for my review. That's it. If you have any, administrative questions or something about something, you can, of course, email me at simond@mybrcc.edu. And that's pretty much it, for the semester. So y'all take care. And of course, I will of course, see you, of course, later.